Hello, happy Tuesday, everybody. Today's lesson is entitled Eisenhower Takes Command. We're finally away from chapter 26 and the Second Red Scare. We are jumping headfirst in the 1950s and the 1960s. This chapter is entitled The Eisenhower Years. So we are going to do a quick track chapter 27 introduction and then jump right into Eisenhower Takes Command. So chapter 27 introduction. Here we go. The 1950s have the popular image of the happy days when the nations prospered and teens enjoyed the new beat of rock and roll music. This nostalgic view of the 50s is correct, but limited. The decade started with a war in Korea and the incrimination of McCarthyism. From the point of view of African Americans, what mattered most about the 1950s was not so much the music of Elvis Presley, but the resistance of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. to segregation in the South. While middle-class suburbanites enjoyed their chrome-trimmed cars and tuned into I Love Lucy on their new television sets, the Cold War and threat of nuclear destruction loomed in the background. So a lot happened in the 1950s and 60s that we are going to talk about over these next 2 weeks. We have the nation reeling from the aftermath of the Korean War, the Cold War, and McCarthyism. And then we have this newfound love hippie vibe known as the Happy Days in the 1950s, and African Americans were turning to Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. because they're they were two prominent figures that exposed the resistance behind segregation in the South. But before we get to all that, a new president has to take the heat of the country, and that it is Eisenhower. Eisenhower. So let's talk about this. Much of Franklin Roosevelt's dominated the 1950s, 30s. President Dwight Eisenhower personified the 1950s. The Republican campaign slogan, I like Ike, expressed the genuine feelings of millions of middle-class Americans. They liked his winning smile and trusted and admired the former general who had successfully commanded Allied forces in Europe in World War II. So we are going to skip the part about the election of 1952 because that's tomorrow's lesson. Um, that's tomorrow's lesson. So, um, so far Eisenhower was well liked, well respected in America. So that's why they liked him and they voted for him. So let's take a look at his domestic policies. As president, Eisenhower adopted a style of leadership that emphasized the delegation of authority. He filled his cabinet with successful corporate executives who gave his administration a business-like tone. His Secretary of Defense, for example, was Charles Wilson, the former head of General Motors. Eisenhower was often criticized by the press for spending too much time golfing and fishing and perhaps entrusting important decisions to others. However, later research showed that behind the scenes Eisenhower was in charge. So Eisenhower really did the delegative task of being president. Eisenhower was a fiscal conservative whose first priority was balancing the budget after years of deficit spending. Although his annual budgets were not always balanced, he came closer to curbing federal spending than any of his successors. As a moderate on domestic issues, he accepted most of the New Deal programs as a reality of modern life, and even extended some of them. During Eisenhower's 2 terms in office, Social Security was extended to 10 million more citizens, the minimum wage was raised, and additional public housing was built. In 1953, Eisenhower consolidated welfare programs by creating the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare under Oberta Kolb Hobby, the first woman in a Republican cabinet. For farmers, a soil bank program was initiated as means of reducing farm production and thereby increasing farm income. On the other hand, Eisenhower opposed the ideas of federal health care insurance and federal aid to education. So some people may consider why Eisenhower is well liked was because of his moderate stance to most issues. Social Security, health, education, to name a few. As the first Republican president since Hoover, Eisenhower called his balanced and moderate approach modern republicanism. His critics called it the bland leading the bland. Interstate highway system. This marked his legacy. So let's write that down. His main legacy because every president has an initiative or thing they want to cross along. Like Trump is make America great again. Obama's was healthy school lunches. So his main accomplishment was the interstate highway system. So that was his mark. Interstate highway system. The most permanent legacy of the Eisenhower years was the passage in 1956 of the Highway Act, which authorized the construction of 42,000 miles of interstate highways linking all of the nation's major cities. When completed, the U.S. highway system became a model for the rest of the world. The justification for new taxes on fuel, tires, and vehicles was to improve national defense. At the same time, the immense public works projects created jobs, promoted the trucking industry, accelerated the growth of the suburbs, and contributed to a more homogeneous national culture. The emphasis on cars, trucks, and highways, however, hurt the railroads and ultimately the environment. Little attention was paid to public transportation, on which the old and the poor depended. So this was Eisenhower's main legacy, but it also drew some critics. Eisenhower's domestic legislation was modest. During his years in office, however, the country enjoyed a steady growth rate with an inflation rate averaging a negligible 1.5%. Although the federal budget had a small surplus only 3 times in 8 years, the deficits fell in relation to the national wealth. For these reasons, some historians rate Eisenhower's economic policies the most successful in any modern president. Between 1945 and 1960, the per capita disposable income of Americans more than tripled. By the mid-1950s, the average American family had twice the real income of a comparative family during the boom years of the 1920s. The post-war economy gave Americans the highest standard of living in the world. So one of the other legacies of the Eisenhower administration was increased prosperity. Because Americans had the highest standard of living in the world, much higher than the boom years of even the 1920s. So increased prosperity. So these two, I believe I'm making a prediction, had big impacts on the election of 1956. Let's see. Towards the end of his first term, Eisenhower suffered a heart attack and had major surgery in 1956. Democrats questioned whether his health was strong enough for election to the second term. 4 years of peace and prosperity, however, made Ike more popular than ever, and the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket was enthusiastically renominated by the Republicans. The Democrats again nominated Stevenson. In this political rematch, Eisenhower won by an even greater margin than the 1952. It was a personal victory only, however, as the Democrats regained control of both houses in Congress. So these two legacy markers, the interstate highway system and of increased prosperity, legacy markers, both made Eisenhower super popular for his second term. So tomorrow we are gonna take a deep dive at the election of 1952 and see what happens.